All right, it is 2:45 on my clock, and it seems like we've had a good number of folks filter over from the last session, so I think it's time to get started. Welcome, you made it to the last session of the day, you survived. There were a lot of great sessions earlier today focused on marine research and as well as some storytelling too. And so for the last session here, we are narrowing down on answering with this lovely panel of speakers here on how do we apply what we know to inform natural resource management, what data gaps and research needs exist. And so, so the way that we're going to do this is we will I'll invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves so you have a little bit more of an idea of who they are and their perspective that they're offering in answering a list of questions that have been prepared for them. And then if we have time, we'll open it up to everyone. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box. And I am getting a little concerned that we lost Nathalie. So whoever's tech support on this one, if you wouldn't mind maybe trying to round her up. Thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate that. So for introductions, let's see, let's start with Carl and then we'll go to you, Bob, and hopefully Nathalie will join us by that time.
All right, afternoon. My name's Carl Weimer. I'm currently the Special Projects Advisor for the Pipeline Safety Trust. I've been with the Pipeline Safety Trust since 2003. I was the executive director up till recently, and I'm kind of sliding into retirement now. So I'm doing special projects and I get to do what I want when I want to, which is kind of nice, a rare occurrence. I also am a recovering county council member. I've been off the council for, I think it's 4 years now, but I'm still recovering. I was on the council for 12 years. And I think during all 12 of those years, I was chair of the Natural Resources Committee. So I dealt with, from the policy standpoint of the county council, everything that you guys have been talking about today. You know, I've got a degree in natural resources, environmental education. I've got another technical degree. I work with the Pipeline Safety Trust at the national level on pipeline safety regulations. So I deal with, I've been in front of Congress lots of times and state legislatures all over. So I have a lot of policy experience on kind of the state and national level, and certainly a lot locally too with my county council hat on. So that's kind of who I'm at, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
I am too, thank you. Bob, if you want to introduce yourself real quick and give us an idea of some of your perspectives you're offering here today.
Sure. So I'm Bob Warinner. I'm the Assistant Regional Habitat Program Manager for this part of the world, Nooksack, Skagit, and San Juans from Washington Fish and Wildlife. I've been working at Washington Fish and Wildlife for about 23 years, which is a super long time. And I've most of my career has been doing salmon kind of recovery planning and technical assistance for restoration projects and so on in the Skagit and San Juans. But I've also done quite a bit of permitting and regulatory work in these areas. And currently I supervise the biologist writing permits for Skagit salmon, or Skagit, Nooksack, and San Juans. And I think that's kind of a important distinction, because from the question, you know, that my agency is a big agency, and we have a lot of different roles in this discussion. But I think from a regulatory perspective is where I'll be speaking today, and I think that it really applies to how science applies in our management of resources.
Excellent, thank you. And right on cue, Nathalie has rejoined us. So Nathalie, if you want to introduce yourself and what perspectives you're offering us today.
Sure, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay, Eleanor?
Yes. Okay,
thanks. Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation to sit on this panel, and also to the Lummi and the Nooksack people for welcoming us today. I work at the Puget Sound Partnership. I'm in the science team there, and my role is to help them report on the health of Puget Sound and with what we call the vital signs. And for those who are not super familiar with the Puget Sound Partnership, we're a small state agency of about 50 people, and we have this very unique role to convene and bring various partners together to support ecosystem recovery. And our signature role is to build the regional plan for recovering the health of the sound called the Action Agenda. So some of you might have heard about the Action Agenda, and we also support local forums. Like in Whatcom County, there is an ecosystem recovery plan that you can check out. But we also have the role of tracking what's happening with the ecosystem, and that's what my team does. We report on like a ton of vital signs for Puget Sound, and we work with monitoring programs from throughout the Sound, and we report on things like stream flow or human well-being, even like sense of place. And so for today, you know, what I want you to know about me is from where I sit, I'm kind of a generalist, and I know a little bit about many subjects from like across the ecosystem. And I also have what I would say a very regional view on the health of the system. It's rare that I get to dig in a particular place like a watershed, like here in Whatcom County. So I actually really appreciated hearing all the talks today and learning about what's specifically concerning folks in this area. So yeah, see me as having a very regional perspective.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to all the panelists for joining us here today. I appreciate all of you agreeing to be part of this. I think that we're going to dig into some really interesting questions here. So without any further ado, I'll get started. So the first question I have here, I'm going to point at Carl and then Bob. So Carl, I'll have you answer first. Based on your experience, how do we apply what we know from research to inform natural resource management?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, you know, we don't know what we don't know. And as a policymaker, you have lots of things coming at you, and you often don't get to hear the latest and greatest science. So certainly one of the things we really need to focus on is, you know, enhanced communications between the scientists, the managers, and the policymakers. And often I think the managers, at least within the county and the different agencies I've worked with, have a fairly good idea of what the latest science is directly from the scientists, but the policymakers don't get that very often. And in the times when that has actually happened, you know, in front of the county council has been pretty eye-opening and helps expand the way policymakers deal with things. So I think one of the things we really need to do is we need to make sure policymakers understand the science and get it. Because often they don't. They've got 47 different things coming and they're worried about, you know, how the garbage is going to get picked up in Point Roberts or something. And make sure that they're hearing it maybe right from the horse's mouth more often. I don't remember, you know, very many times while I was on 12 years on the county council, scientific groups coming to want to talk to us directly. It always was filtered through the management people within the county. And sometimes they had their own little issues going on about budgets and what they wanted us to hear and what they didn't want us to hear. So it's really nice if we get to hear stuff directly from the scientists and help us understand it better. So I'll leave it at there and let Bob go.
Thanks for that, Bob.
Yeah, that's kind of great, Carl. That kind of sets up what I was thinking here too. So like I said, I'm involved with the regulatory part of the agency here, and you know, Fish and Wildlife prides itself on being a science-based organization, and having science inform our decision-making and management of the species. Now, what Carl said, you know, when you're talking about policy, you know, it really gets in the way sometimes, because we basically work at the pleasure, we work at the pleasure of the Fish and Wildlife Commission, who are appointed by the legislature. And so there's a lot of politics that get into our decision-making and management. But I think that when we have some specific information, and it helps guide our regulations, it's really important. So for example, in the nearshore areas, we have more and more specific data about the spawning of forage fish with surf smelt and sand lance. And we have actually changed our regulation on how we allow work on the beach with additional safeguards that come directly from the data that's been collected on those species. And I think that you know, if we, as you know, along my career, it's really lately we've had a nexus with this data informing our protections. And it's the more data we get that's specific to these types of habitats and species, that is directly relatable to the type of work that people need to do in the nearshore. It's really kind of improves our protection. And so, but with the policy lens that I was talking about earlier, unless we have really specific information that can dictate why we're doing the things that we're doing and the requirements that we're requiring people or to go through to do their projects, we really don't have a leg to stand on. And so the scientists that are out there collecting that data, informing our policy, and then we can go back to the public and to the legislature to say, we're going to require you to do this, and this is why. And so sometimes we get into a quagmire where we have a policy that's specifically requiring people to do something, but we don't really have the answer of why. And so then, when we go to court over something like that, we can get into trouble, and that the resource isn't as thoroughly protected.
Thanks, lots to think about. The next question we have is for Nathalie and then Bob again, but I'll have Nathalie answer first so you can have a moment to catch your breath from answering the last question, Bob. So Nathalie, what data gaps and research needs have you experienced? What types of research do you wish there was more of to inform your decisions?
Thanks, Eleanor. Yeah, I think actually Bob's answer set up, well, some of the points I want to have come across. I'd say that, yeah, definitely there are gaps in data and research that I've experienced. And there's probably actually an infinite number of gaps that we can point to. And I could even point to gaps that I heard even today from, talks about green crabs or strategies to manage pinnipeds or climate and thresholds for impacts that Katie just mentioned in the last talk. But, I want to stay a little bit more general and but brings what I learned from the vital sign world, where we're pretty good at describing the status and trends of things like eelgrass and salmon, thanks to so many great monitoring programs out there. But it's still generally difficult to understand the causes behind those problems, the why that Bob was just talking about, and how much humans are responsible for those patterns that we see in the data, and how much it's just natural variability or climate factors even. So for instance, like we know herring populations go up and down. They're generally, things are getting worse for them. And there are many factors that we can point to, but it's hard to pinpoint exactly what's going on. And I think Don Cruz in his talk actually alluded to that independently of my preparation for today. So, that means that there's still a lot of uncertainties and we don't necessarily have all that good actionable information to do something about the problem. There's a couple of other gaps I want to talk about too. And one relates to knowing what's effective in our interventions to save Puget Sound, right? We know less about what's most effective. We know even less about cumulative effects of, let's say, all the good restoration work that we're doing out there. We hear policy and decision makers often saying like, what's the greatest return on investment? And these are difficult questions and we need more funding and capacity to do all that kind of work. So the last gap I want to talk about is what I see related to knowledge of environmental injustices around our region and a gap in participation of more diverse groups in our science processes. At least in our eco-recovery efforts world, we're missing key perspectives and insights from communities who've been impacted or historically excluded. And we heard Tammy Woodrich this morning mention this desire to network. And I think we have this responsibility to foster more inclusivity in our network where we, for instance, engage authentically local traditional or indigenous knowledge and figure out how to use both indigenous ways of knowing and Western science together. So I guess as a recap, I think there's gaps relating to the factors or causes for the problems we see, gaps around effectiveness and cumulative effects. And then I think we're missing key perspectives from historically impacted communities in our work.
Thank you. Lots to think about again. Bob, what do you?
Great. Thanks, Nathalie. That's great. You took a little of my fire though. So I think that a couple of things that I'm thinking of as far as gaps. One is kind of what I touched on already about the specific information regarding impacts of work in the water, or impacts of what we're doing, what development and other things are doing to our species. Like we have a bridge going in right now. We're trying to determine what the impact are on the juvenile fish swimming by that bridge. And we really have very little science to help us guide the regulatory part of that. And so just kind of more and more of that type of information, I think will be helpful. But what Nathalie just said regarding kind of the overall cumulative effect, I think, of restoration and other things. I mean, there's a cumulative effect of bad things happening, but I think the cumulative effect of restoration and where we're spending all this money, and you know, I often get questioned, you know, what's the response? Where is the signal coming back from the salmon returning to the river? You know, requiring these restrictions on fishing, and you're spending billions of dollars on restoration. Where's our salmon? You know, why are they not coming back? And I think that, you know, that's a question that's super hard to answer. And it's, you know, I don't know if it is even answerable, but really kind of what's happening outside of our local terminal areas, and even terminal areas being Puget Sound, and then kind of helping to determine what the effect is of the good work we're doing in a kind of holistic way, I think is a huge data gap.
Thank you. Gosh, I appreciate all of your answers so much. I feel like they only raise more questions. So Carl, you're up next in the rotation. How do you see research and policy makers working together to get what we ultimately need, sailor sea protection?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's needed, and I kind of alluded to it before, is more direct communication between policymakers and the research scientists, and probably some better coordination about, you know, here's the things that policymakers are working on, because we often have our plans and we're going to review the shoreline plan, or we're going to review the growth management plan or something, and how does that relate to the science that's going on too, and what's the best science that helps inform those policies. And often, you know, the science and the policymakers are working in different silos and don't talk to each other probably when they ought to. The other thing policymakers often run into is that they often don't have good scientists supporting them. So we get into trying to argue about science versus common sense. I don't know how many times, oh, it just makes common sense to build bulkheads and stuff along the shorelines because that'll protect the beach. Well, maybe not, but where's the scientist that's going to give the policymaker the backup to show, you know, that common sense isn't always the best thing. There's an argument in the county right now about dredging the Nooksack River. We'd love to get some science on the idea of, is dredging the river good, bad? It's probably not that clear cut. There's probably times when dredging is good and when it's not. It's complicated. And often we're looking at these things and there's no way for the policymaker to know, as Bob kind of said, whether we're making progress or not. So some clear metrics that will show us, okay, I just passed an impervious surface ordinance, so we're protecting our streams from more impervious surface. Is that really making a difference? Or is anybody really enforcing any of that at the permit office? So direct communications between the scientists and policymakers and better organization, so the science that's being fed to policymakers is what they're working on at the time, would really be a benefit.
Thank you for that response. The last question that we have here is for Nathalie, and then we can move into some general questions from the audience. So feel free to type those questions into the chat box now. So Nathalie, some argue that we have a lot of data and need to focus on getting the policies we know we need in place. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
Thanks. Well, I think first, I totally get, and I've heard people say, like, we don't need any more data, enough with the science, like, we just need to take action. I think Katie, again, the previous talk heard that in her research. And I think we can make like a very general statement that there is lots of research and monitoring, collecting data out there, but I think we should caveat it by saying that this is a generalization and perhaps not broadly applicable, as there are areas where we don't have enough data, and Carl just gave an example of that. And so it's kind of funny, this question is a bit the reverse of like the data gap question, and I'm sure that everyone here has a story about how they would like to have more, data on green crabs or contaminants or climate. I think, we have to admit that the ecosystem is complex and it's ever changing. So we do need the research and the data to keep up with these changing dynamics. I think sometimes the data may be there, but the data, first needs to be accessible, easy to locate, and practical. And again, Katie, she talked about a clearinghouse, and I think those are good ideas, and it helps make data more available. Other times we might have a lot of data, but it's not always the right data for the management and the policy question. So, or it's not packaged in a way that decision makers can use, and that's come up. I think Carl talked about that earlier too. So I think it's one thing to say that we have a lot of data, and another thing to say that we have like all the analyses and interpretations to make meaning out of the data. So like the data alone is not sufficient, and it needs time and efforts to synthesize and convey it in a way that is, that we need to pair the data with the communication. And this also came up earlier where, the way we communicate about the data is so important. I think we need more sort of digesting and distillation of information that is, targeting the questions that managers and decision makers have, and sometimes even fellow scientists. And, I think, for the younger people out there that might be listening, we need people, that have a foot in both the worlds of science, but also in the management and policy, that have the skill and the capacity to bring that information to the right places. So I think there's like a bit of a shift in our focus more on like the distillation of this complex environmental data into actionable information that's easily understood and, audience specific. And again, a theme that came through from Katie's talk. And but in general, I think everybody today in these talks did a great job at presenting really well the data and talking about the implications for the challenges that we have facing this region.
Certainly. Thank you for that response. Lots and lots of great things to think about. And I think there are a lot of things that we can sort of jump off and explore that came up today from this conversation, as well as some of the previous talks. So we do have one question, and I think this might be all that we have time for. Becky asked, and I think any of you could answer this, so I'll kind of let you guys decide which one wants to take it. It's about monitoring. How do we make the case for sustained funding for monitoring that the scientists need to provide the information that policymakers need to make the decisions, or regulators the backup for like how do we get more money for funding so that we are able to provide the information needed to make the case that what we're doing is working, or what we might need to do in order to change some of that, so that we have better communication with the decision makers and the regulators.
Okay, guys, go. All right, I'll take a short crack at it. So I think that Carl was talking about having the policy people and the science people communicate is a good idea. And I think that if we were to identify the questions that are being asked by the people that are being affected by our regulatory information, our regulatory processes and so on, and even the users of the resources, if we can identify the questions and make them very clear, and they come over and over and over again, and we can show how those questions are important to the public and to the people that are voting for our politicians and so on, then we can say, in order to answer these questions, we have specific things that we need to know to answer them. And I think that that's a way that we can make that case. And I just really think that it's not something that is very obvious to people. I think that because they want to spend money on doing things that are on the ground, that have like a proven, very visible thing that is done, and not necessarily the more kind of cerebral question answering information.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the place to start is making sure we have like the right questions and objectives that can be help set up the monitoring. What comes to mind too is like more, I think a lot of the local monitoring we get is from community science programs. And, they're they get more and more robust and I think well supported. And, people just sort of have affection and connect with those programs. I think at the state level, maybe there's also a responsibility to ensure that the way the data are collected can be sort of stratified or scaled down, or or a bite can be taken out of it to understand what's happening in a particular local area. I mean, it's true that, I think ecosystem monitoring programs are more funded at a regional level than at a local level. But, ensuring that those programs, that their designs can provide data more locally might be a way to infuse information into people's places where people care about their backyards and they want to know what's happening there.
Carl, you have anything you want to add, or?
Yeah, I think it was covered pretty well. Certainly there's issues that, like Bob said, that policymakers hear about over and over again, and they rise to the top. So, if there's issues that policymakers aren't hearing about, someone needs to make sure they hear about them over and over again. Fecal coliform pollution of our shellfish beds was one that we'd heard about for 20 years and have been working on there was local funding then devoted for some of that monitoring, because it became a big issue for the tribes and for farmers and for all kinds of people in the community. So, moving those issues to the top, and certainly citizen science can play a big role in making the dollar go farther too. I think sometimes policymakers kind of think about citizen science as, well, isn't that nice, but is it really science? So there needs to be some information to policymakers about good citizen science, and maybe some that's just more feel good.
I personally love community science, so I love ending on that note. So thank you, Carl, and thank you, Bob, and thank you, Natalie. I really appreciated all that you guys shared today with us, and I hope everyone else has lots and lots of great stuff to walk away with and think about in terms of how can we continue to move on from here to further protect the Salish Sea, and more specifically the shorelines of Whatcom County. So with that, we are at the end of our session, so I will unspotlight our speakers so you guys don't have to stick around in the spotlight while I just wrap things up here. So real quickly, I wanted to make sure that there was a big thank you given to all of those on the planning, that were involved with the planning for this, including Austin Rose with Whatcom County Public Works, Becky Peterson with Geneva Consulting, Bridget Trosson with Washington Sea Grant, Cheryl Lovato Niles, Washington State University Whatcom County Extension, Cindy Fabry with Effect Consulting, Rebecca Schlatterback with Public Utility District Number 1, also Mike for providing tech support today. I think that some of us would have been a lot more lost without his help and support throughout the day. A big thank you to the Whatcom Watershed Information Network for hosting this event. This would not have happened without WIN. I urge you all to go check out WIN's website to find out about upcoming speaker series events, and other things like this that you can check out. There's Whatcom Water Week that will happen in September. All of the presenters today, huge appreciation to all of you. I really appreciated everyone sharing their gifts with us today. As Tammy kind of set the pace earlier, whether it was storytelling or poetry or the latest research that you and your groups have been working on that can help us move further along. So thank you. And I encourage you all, this is recorded. And so the recording might take a little while to all get up and posted, but you should be able to check it out on the WIN website within the next week or so. And Cheryl, thank you so much for posting the survey link. Please, please, please take the survey. It's on SurveyMonkey. You'll also get an email tomorrow reminding you to take the survey. It is a really quick survey. I promise it shouldn't take you too long. No more than 5 minutes tops, probably more like 3 minutes. And if you take it, you can also be in the drawing for a gift certificate. So that's always fun as a little appreciation for showing up today and taking our survey so that we can better understand how we can provide more presentations like this in the future. And I see that it is 3:16. I think I covered it all. Is there anything else for the good of the order that anyone wants to shout out? Feel free to. Thank you everyone for adding into the chat box. I echo everyone's thanks to everyone for helping this happen today. And with that, I think, well, it's looking a little cloudy outside, but hopefully you still get to enjoy some of your day outside and some of this sort of end of winter weather. So thanks. Enjoy, everyone.
Thanks,